Order, order. The sitting is resumed. I think we're in for an interesting afternoon's debate. And the subject is public procurement of infrastructure in South West. I have the privilege and honour to call Mr. Gary Streeter.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. McRae, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And it's also a pleasure to see the Minister in this place and recognise that he hasn't been carrying out his duties for a very long time, and I know that the issues I'm about to raise are possibly cross-cutting departments, and therefore, Dr. McRae, I don't expect him to be an expert in his response, but there may be some issues on which he would want to come back to me after the event. So I want to raise with the Minister today a very specific example of where public procurement of infrastructure in the South West could, in my opinion, be greatly improved. But before I get on to that, may I say how much I welcome the extra investment the government is making in our nation's infrastructure. I often think that government does far too much, but one of the things that government can do really well, and perhaps is the only organisation that can do it, is to ensure that the infrastructure of the country, whether transport or education or communications or whatever, is in a first-class condition, as you would expect from a first-class country. I'm very glad that our disciplined adherence to our long-term economic plan has released the resources to invest in our country in this way. In particular, in our region of the South West, and let me clarify, Dr. McRae, that the South West for this purpose is the 7 counties of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Dorset, Wiltshire, Gloucestershire and Bristol, a vast region stretching from the Isles of Scilly and Land's End in the south to the Forest of Dean in the north and Stonehenge in the east. Doesn't quite take in Northern Ireland, but it comes quite close, Dr. McRae. May I welcome the 2 recent major announcements of infrastructure spending and improvements in our part of the world. First of all, the dualling of the A303 all the way from the M3 to the M5 with a tunnel under Stonehenge, which, when complete, will give us in the far southwest a second major arterial road to underpin our growing economy. And I'm also exceedingly grateful to the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Transport for the commitment given to work with the Peninsula Rail Task Force to work up their 3-point plan into a deliverable proposal with timings and costings that will give the far southwest a rail service fit for the 21st century, including 2.25-hour journey times from Plymouth to Paddington, and all of this is very welcome. But my specific concern, and the reason for calling this debate today, is about the way the coalition government has recently chosen to procure the building of new schools and the refurbishment of existing schools throughout our region. Now, there are, of course, some who think that it doesn't matter what school buildings and classrooms are like for education as long as the teachers are good. But I don't agree with that. Modern, well-designed buildings can lift the spirit and help a child to attain his or her potential, and therefore the gradual replacement of ancient school buildings, of which we have many in the South West, is extremely important to the academic prospects of the next generation. The EFA Regional Framework is a 4-year arrangement through which the Education Funding Agency, academies, local authorities and other educational establishments can arrange contracts for individual school projects, both new build and refurbishment. In July 2014, the Education Funding Agency's regional framework appointed 7 contractors for Lot 4, which is the bureaucratic description, rather unromantic, for the South West, Lot 4, and thereby hangs the first problem I wish to raise with the Minister. Not one of the construction companies which are on our regional framework are local to the South West, not one of them. And yet there are some outstanding construction companies in our region, many of them with an excellent track record on public sector projects. Not one of them made it onto the list. I would go further than that, indeed, that some of the companies who are on the list do not have a proven track record in our region at all. I certainly give way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the honourable member for giving way, and he may have, in a way, have answered my question, but could he elaborate for me the process of the procurement? In Northern Ireland we have procurement. A lot of councils in Northern Ireland that are close together would have clusters and they would do a lot of procurement together. Does it operate the same way? The procurement system operate the same way?
Dr. McRae, it's a very helpful and interesting question, and I am going to come on to describe the procurement process in a moment, but the Honourable Gentleman may be able to understand it more clearly than I do, because I find it extremely complex. And I think that's one of the things that has gone wrong here. The system itself is complex and, dare I say it, overly bureaucratic. So not one of the regional companies have made it onto the list. And I believe, and this is the thrust of what I'm raising with the Minister today, that essential changes are needed to the framework system in order for local businesses to get a fair chance at winning these prize public procurement contracts and projects, and it sounds like it's a similar situation in Northern Ireland. And I don't suppose for a moment the South West is unique in this, and I think this is an issue that civil servants and ministers do need to give a little more thought to. Now, of course, I understand the benefits of a multi-user framework agreement in procurement. They are a pre-competed route to market, procuring a vehicle to centralise procurement spend. They also share procurement expertise and resources and risk and contract management. They reduce the administrative burden in terms of the time and cost of running a full procurement procedure each time. This sort of work is also very attractive to suppliers in such volumes. But, Dr. McRae, and I use my words carefully, it is an insult to our region, yes, an insult, to exclude all of our companies, and it may also be counterproductive, as I shall hopefully explain. But first of all, how did this come about? And here I will try and explain the process as I understand it. The EFA were looking to engage with the market prior to issuing the official journal of the European Union notice in 2013 to invite ideas as how to best encourage the markets at a local level to participate in tendering for the framework on offer in a way that will deliver the most economically advantageous commercial agreement for all parties. Although local companies did apply in the South West, many of them with a tremendous track record of delivering schools over many years, this clearly had no effect on the outcome, as I've already mentioned, of the 7 construction companies chosen. Not one of them is local. And these are the final 7. The first one is a French company called Bouygues, B-O-U-Y-G-U-E-S. My speech will be available afterwards for Hansard writers, which headquarters in Paris, France. Mr. Chairman. The second one is BAM, headquarters in Bunnik in the Netherlands. Third one, Skanska, better known perhaps, headquarters Stockholm, Sweden. Interserve, the fourth one, Interserve, a well-known British company based in the southeast. ISG plc, United Kingdom company based in the southeast. Galliford Try, United Kingdom company based in the southeast. And then Kia, well-known UK company based in the southeast. Now, I accept that the first 3 international companies have small UK offices, but they are essentially overseas companies, no relationship to the West Country whatsoever, and profits made are unlikely to be spent in the United Kingdom. And of course, I recognise the world in which we live, and multinational corporations get contracts in every country, and they work and contribute to our country. But I firmly believe that regionally based companies are able to deliver schools successfully in a cost-effective manner, and so should not have been excluded from the EFA framework. Local companies are much more likely to understand and wish to contribute to the community in which they are working. And it's also the case that international companies tend to bring with them their own supply chain and specialist subcontractors. Now, the Minister may be thinking of saying in his response, it may be written in front of him already, that if a contract is won by a major national or international company, they will subcontract parts of that work to local companies. But I urge him not to say that, because the evidence on the ground is that it's more often than not, it simply doesn't happen. They bring their own supply chains with them. Now, it might help the House to understand that there were plenty of alternatives to the way that the government has chosen to proceed. For example, Midas Construction, one of the outstanding and successful construction companies in our region, have developed something they call the Midas Model School Solution. This concept is now in its 5th year and has delivered 13 cost-effective schools over the 5-year period. It began with the requirement to deliver a primary school pursuant to Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. A housing development contractor had a view that they could deliver the school directly in a more cost-effective manner and use surplus monies to fund IT equipment. The school was designed on the standard template, using a framed solution with traditional construction. The concept allowed for future expansion from a one-form to a two-form school as the housing development progressed. The school was delivered successfully and benchmarked approximately 20% lower than the Department for Education allowance. The project was successful and consequently rolled out across a number of their other sites and local authorities. So the evidence is that the model school is between 15% and 20% cheaper on average than the traditional route used for public procurement. The model has proved to be adaptable over time, but most powerful testament is that every head teacher has been happy to accept the learning environment as fit for their school, and after years of use remain delighted with the product. But now this model, and others like it, are currently excluded from the Southwest because of the way the new framework agreement has been put together. Not only this model has been excluded, but some excellent regional firms have also been excluded. I've already mentioned the extra-based firm Midas Construction, but what about Henry Pollard and Sons from Bridgewater and Somerset, also excluded? Or Rearc Limited, based in my own constituency? Or Ryden Limited in Bristol? Or Devon Contractors, another extra-based concern, all capable of building and refurbishing local schools, all of them excluded because of a needlessly bureaucratic approach to procurement. I certainly give way.
Member for giving way. I'm sure he'll agree with me. It flies in the face of government policy to try and rejuvenate the local economy again. And certainly in my part of the United Kingdom, many companies have fallen foul of this because of EU rules and legislation. If it's over a certain price, it has to go out, and the honourable member has explained that. But it flies in the face of government policy. Surely, if we are to get the indigenous businesses operating again, it's going to benefit the local economy and jobs.
Well, I absolutely agree with the honourable member. And one of the things I will come on to say is that it does fly in the face of government policy, but I don't really think ministers are aware necessarily, and I wouldn't necessarily expect them to be aware of the detail of these very technical framework agreements being put in place, which I understand that very clever people have brought this about for all the right reasons, well-intentioned, but the upshot is that we've produced a product which the local people are not happy with, and as the honourable friend here says, it flies in the face of government policy. So that's why I'm asking this minister, and I'm feeling optimistic that he is going to come in a moment and say he's going to revamp the entire process. So that's going to be good. So the Department of the Environment and Rural Affairs have a strategy for buying locally. Why is it not possible for the Department for Education to do the same for contractors? Local procurement is something that all public bodies must become far better at doing. In a region like the Southwest, our economy would be transformed if government departments, government agencies, local authorities, health service, emergency services, and so on, all procured locally wherever possible, especially for major projects. Now, the Minister may be tempted in his reply to say that it is possible for a local authority or an academy to contract with a construction company to build a school with a company not on the framework agreement. He may be tempted to say that, but I urge him not to hide behind that thought, because it would almost certainly never happen. Why would anybody or any committee wishing to build a new school voluntarily take on board an additional risk? Because most decision makers, when grappling with this issue, will feel the need to play it safe and stick with what will be perceived to be, and this is the tragedy here, these 7 construction companies will now be perceived to be government-approved contractors, and it puts everyone else onto a second-class footing, and that's simply not right or fair. Now, my second point, less wordy second point, Dr. McRae, is that the framework agreement actually increases the cost for the taxpayer. And this is how I understand it works. The contractors in the framework appear to have been selected via a contract notice being published on the Tenders Electronic Daily. This is the online version of the supplement to the official journal of the EU dedicated to European public procurement. The notice asked potential suppliers to bid to be part of the framework. So far, so good. Bidders have to have a minimum financial turnover threshold of £25 million for the region and are supposed to be evaluated on the basis of essential and specific criteria, which together offer the most economically advantageous tender. However, the system of bidding for being part of the framework is not based on which contractor can do the job at the lowest price with the highest quality. It is based on which 7 construction companies are closest to the mean average of the bids offered. The system penalises competitive pricing and rewards higher bids. The winners are those who, by chance, bid close to the mean or the average of all of the bids. Now, the pricing criterion contributes to 70% of the overall score, which cannot result in the most economically advantageous tenders. By way of example, one local construction company I've spoken with outscored 4 of the 7 chosen construction companies in quality, therefore meaning that those 4 were not the most capable of delivering the product. The successful framework bidders following selection then need to participate in a subsequent local competition process for each particular project. This time, the competition process is scored 70% on quality and 30% on price. At least 4 of the 7 construction companies chosen have little or no experience or track record in the region, it is highly unlikely that in the context of the local market, a competitive price will be procured. They certainly do not have a track record for £3 to £7 million education projects in these areas, which is typically the kind of project that they're going to be asked to compete for. And this is unlike some of the local construction companies that I have already mentioned, excluded from the list. So with such limited competition and only 30% of the award criteria on price, it is close to inevitable that any public sector bodies using this framework will pay non-competitive prices. So I would like to ask the Minister what kind of mind came up with a selection criteria that did not judge quality and price, but focused on selecting those bids which were closest to the average rather than the cheapest. Surely if the quality threshold had been crossed, the taxpayer should expect to pay the cheapest price and not the one closest to the average. If I've misunderstood the process, I'm sure the Minister will correct me when he responds. Now, I suspect this selection criteria was put together by very intelligent, as I said before, very well-intentioned officials in the DFES and Cabinet Office, and we are so well served by our civil service in this country, Dr. McRae, and I'm not in any way criticising them. But I suspect there was next to zero input from ministers on this kind of technical decision-making. Having been a minister myself 1,000 years ago when someone called Sir John Major was the Prime Minister of this country, and we were talking in those days about procuring new magistrates' courts using something quite new in those days, PFI contracts. I know that technical issues like that are really largely taken forward by civil servants, and perhaps that's right, but there does need to be this political, this regional input, an understanding of what people in the region how they might respond to the end product. So we've ended up with a process that excludes local firms and does not choose the cheapest price. I don't think that is a good day's work. So finally, my final point, I turn to the involvement of foreign contractors. Now, of course, the necessity of the current framework itself comes from Europe. However, in spite of it being a Europe-wide requirement to treat companies equally regardless of origin, and I support that, that's absolutely right, it is increasingly hard, according to several construction companies I have spoken to, for British companies to work in other European countries. One director told me he was been laughed at even for suggesting that a British company might win a contract in France. And I wonder if the Minister can name any major construction projects undertaken directly by British companies in France where the French government is paying. And yet we have placed one on our framework agreement for the West Country. The 4 freedoms guaranteed for the internal market of the European Union are not enforced or strictly kept to in other countries, which creates an unfair system where British businesses and SMEs are limited in where they can work. So why do we bend over backwards in this country to gold plate and comply with every jot and tittle of the rules when our European competitors do not? So I'm afraid that this new way of procuring schools in the southwest I would have to describe it as a lose-lose. It favours multinational and centralised national firms that have no vested interests in the area at the expense of regional firms. It's likely to reduce the opportunities for local contractors rather than increase them, and it's been put together in a way that does not guarantee the selection of the lowest price for the taxpayer. I urge the Minister to look into this matter very carefully indeed, and if possible to adapt or terminate the current framework agreement, which has another 3 years plus to run. If not, the Government can expect that feelings of deep dissatisfaction and deep resentment on this matter in the South West will continue to rumble on. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Manley.
Thank you very much, Dr. McRae, and I'm very grateful to you for hosting this debate, and particularly wanted to put on record my gratitude to the Honourable Member for securing this debate. Although in recent weeks we have had some debate in this place and the other place about the contracting out of services, he's put very firmly on the agenda the issues around the contracting out of infrastructure, which is becoming much, much more important, especially at the moment, because, as he rightly says, there is now some new funding being brought forward in order to replace the funding that was lost under Building Schools for the Future in the education area in particular. And listening to his speech, I could feel his frustration about the way in which this process has resulted in an outcome that has shut out some of the outstanding construction companies in his region. And I have to say that I think that is a frustration that is shared in many other parts of the country too, particularly for those companies who have a strong track record of providing goods, services and contracts in the public sphere, and who understandably, I think, feel that this sends a very strong message to them that their work has not been valued. And whilst I wouldn't suggest for a moment that the government has intended to produce this outcome, I think he is right to put it very firmly, not just on the Minister's agenda, but on mine as well as the spokesperson for the opposition. And I think that frustration is particularly felt in areas of the country where local authorities have pushed ahead with a local procurement agenda that has sought to build on the expertise in local areas and in regions to ensure that the benefits of those contracts are felt fully in the areas in which they are granted, but where they look to national government to do the same and find that many of those contracts have been awarded to overseas companies or companies out of the area. I'll certainly give way.
Honourable Member for giving way, but the Honourable Member that has brought the debate made the point that it was laughable that someone from the United Kingdom would get a contract in France. And that is one of the major problems. When you go to other countries, they practice protectionism. We're not very good at that. And I don't think we should do it. But certainly other countries of the European Union does. And that has a detrimental and knock-on effect to the rest of the United Kingdom.
Yes, and I'll come on in a moment to some of the things that I think the government might consider doing to perhaps better strike the balance in this country to ensure that we don't shut out some of the best companies that we have with a really strong track record of delivery. And what I would say, first of all, is to the Minister in particular, is that we accept that there is a balance to be struck when commissioning goods and services and big capital projects of the sort that the Honourable Gentleman described, between obviously trying to guarantee value for money and trying to ensure the maximum social good and local good. But as the Honourable Gentleman, I think, illustrated really well during his speech, quite often those two things are complementary and not in contrast to one another. And it's particularly the case when you look at what's happened to the economy in this country, and particularly the regional economies and very local economies, over recent years, it makes a significant difference when services are procured locally and regionally, because that money remains in the region, as the Honourable Gentleman said, that jobs are created, that salaries are boosted, that every pound that goes into the pockets of working people in regions like the North West or the South West, where the Honourable Gentleman is based, every pound that goes into the pockets of working people is then spent again in local shops and local businesses, and that cycle continues of growth. And what we've seen in recent years is quite simply the opposite. And whilst I accept that this government has no huge plans to invest in our regions in the next few years, the government has significant spending power. £187 billion spent by national government on public procurement in 2012, and I think there may be some more recent figures as well, and that can have a significant impact if it's spent in local areas. And as the Honourable Gentleman said, big national contracts aren't always value for money. He made the point that many of the construction companies that he was talking about have proven track records actually in his region. We've seen what happens as well when big national contracts are handed out without a real understanding of local areas. The work programme was probably the most stark example, but this applies to infrastructure as well. And as the Honourable Gentleman said, I think one of the critical things that the government could do is think about the impact that procuring services from outside of the region has on supply chains, because as the Honourable Gentleman said, often companies who come in from outside local areas bring their own supply chains with them. I think the government also needs to recognise quite strongly that there is, at the moment, in the way that we contract and procure services and goods, there is a power imbalance that exists between the prime contractor and any subcontractors or those providing services as well. And there was a recent example of this with Capita and the civil service training scheme, which the Minister will be very well aware of, a £250 million contract that was supposed to be about opening up the best deal to the taxpayer, but where subcontractors suffered a great deal as a result of the way that the terms of that contract were drawn. And I think we have to think, even where we decide that we're going to award contracts to big multinational firms, often based and operating overseas, even where we do that, we need to think much more clearly about how we balance that power relationship and ensure that those that further down the supply chain are protected. One of the ways in which we really ought to do that is to get a grip on the way in which payment is made to providers, and quite often in the procurement that we carry out, that quite simply isn't thought about at the very beginning. One of the other ways that the government could really help to move this agenda forward, I think, is to concentrate very strongly on the expertise that exists within government, of which there is a great deal, but is patchy across different government departments, and about the staffing levels that are needed too. And just one example of this, of course, was the West Coast Main Line franchise, which was a £50 billion contract that was managed in the original instance by just 3 civil servants. We think the government could do more as well to think about the impact, the wider impact of commissioning and procurement on the public. One way that they could do that, and we would strongly encourage them to do so, is to introduce a public interest test when they are going through the procurement process. And we have committed to ring-fencing some contracts for companies in pursuit of a public service mission, which has now and quite recently become one of the tools in the government's armoury. I'd be very interested to know whether the government has thought about doing the same. We are also very committed, Dr. McRae, to a community right to challenge where major projects have been announced that don't seem to be of enormous benefit to local areas or to regions. And it would be interesting to apply that community right to challenge in this case, because I suspect that the honourable member speaks for many people in his constituency and indeed across the southwest of England in feeling very angry about the fact that many organisations, many firms who could have delivered those projects have not made it onto the list. One of the ways in which local providers can be of particular help is that they understand the local workforce. It's one of the reasons why we have committed that any national contract or major infrastructure project that is worth over £1 million would specify that apprenticeships would have to be provided as part of that deal. Now, there is a particular benefit of procuring those services locally and regionally, because quite often those firms, the sorts of firms that the honourable gentleman mentioned in his speech, will have knowledge of the local workforce. They will already be working with education providers and with other local businesses to help provide opportunities for young people. And in fact, the Minister visited the youth zone in Wigan, in my constituency, recently, which has a very, very good record of working with local employers and with local education providers to make sure that those links are made. On High Speed 2, that would have provided 33,000 apprenticeships alone. We think the government could commit to doing that. And also just to think about as well, when commissioning projects and services, to think about the impact on the staff involved too. We've seen some appalling examples in recent years of companies who have been commissioned from outside of a local area to provide services. There was a particular example during the Olympics of a company in the Wigan Borough that was provided in order to steward parts of the Olympics, and the treatment of the staff in that company was found, when it was investigated, to be absolutely appalling, undercutting the minimum wage, no regard whatsoever for people's terms and conditions, even to the extent that staff were made to sleep under a bridge overnight in order to carry out their duties. And that case hit national headlines. But there is a particular impact, I think, of taking into account the strong and existing ties that local firms have with their own workforce, the need to preserve their integrity and their reputation. And the honourable gentleman talked about it in his speech. And I think it would be right to recognise that when we think about spending what are very large sums of public money, that we should think about what the impact of that will be on the people who end up delivering those services. And I would also say to the Minister that one of the very welcome things that this government has done is to introduce the Social Value Act, which I know the Minister's predecessor, but one was a very, very strong supporter of. Recently, the government published the review of the Social Value Act to see what impact that's had. The review by Lord Young unfortunately concluded that it's had fairly limited impact, but ruled out extending the Social Value Act to goods and services, which could potentially have made a huge difference to the sort of commissioning approach that we've heard about today. But the ethos, surely, of the Social Value Act goes beyond just its limited scope at the present time. And I would be really interested to know what the Minister is planning to do to try and extend the spirit of the Social Value Act to the sorts of projects that the honourable gentleman was talking about. One of the points that Lord Young made in the review that was published recently was that very few public sector commissioners actually know about the Social Value Act as it stands. So I hope the government will tell us today that it will be taking up his invitation to much more heavily promote the Social Value Act and the principles that lie behind it, because although at the present time it doesn't apply directly to school infrastructure projects, the spirit and the ethos of the Act would have been extremely helpful here. And just finally, Dr McRae, to say to the Minister is that there is also an agenda that is coming, I think, to most regions, regardless of who is in government after the next election, and that is with all three of the major political parties committed to a greater devolution agenda, that this is something that we really need to think through and get right in advance of power being devolved to city and county regions and indeed locally, because as more and more of these spending decisions are taken at a local and regional level, getting this right will become really very important indeed. It would make a nonsense of the devolution agenda if the responsibility for major projects lay with national government that didn't take account of the strengths and the talents that exist in regions like the South West. And so I'd be very interested to hear what the government has planned as part of that devolution agenda to ensure that we draw on those skills and that we help to boost growth and productivity in every region of the UK and not just in a small section.
I call Minister, Mr Robertson.
Well, thank you, Dr McRae, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for South West Devon for initiating this debate, and I know that he is a great champion of his constituents and of Devon, but also of the wider South West region, and I think this debate today is evidence of that fact. I want to make some general comments, if I may, to start with, Dr McRae, and then move on to the specific issues that my honourable friend has raised during the course of the debate. Changing and improving the way that the public sector spends money on goods and services has been a government priority since 2010. We have brought about unprecedented and comprehensive reform across all areas of procurement and will continue to do so, making Whitehall leaner, more efficient, so that Britain can compete in a global sense. Through our rigorous commercial reform programme, stripping out waste and buying more goods and services centrally, we've made the way that we do business in central government quicker, more competitive, more transparent, better value and far simpler than ever before. These commercial reforms, combined with a baseline of spend in 2009-10, have created savings of £2.9 billion in 2010-11, £3 billion in 2011-12, £3.8 billion in 2012-13, and £5.4 billion in 2013-14. To be regarded as a global competitor, Britain must ensure that the right investment is made in national infrastructure, with a focused investment in skills, technology, and efficiency initiatives that help businesses to operate and expand in a global economy. The construction industry underpins the growth of this sector and enables future prosperity. We're reforming public construction enterprises to make them more efficient, more collaborative, more innovative and more competitive, both at home and abroad, ensuring that money we spend boosts Britain's competitiveness and delivers greater social mobility. We're rebalancing the economy to achieve strong, lasting growth and widely shared prosperity. The government construction strategy is about cutting waste and reforming our procurement processes, reinvesting the savings we make in more progressive ventures that stimulate the economy, ensuring liquidity of all businesses, big and small. It gives us a competitive advantage, underpins economic growth and generates higher quality jobs. We're backing industries of the future and making Britain a great place to do business. The construction pipeline provides over £127 billion worth of strategic investment opportunities for businesses from this year onwards, a significant boost to the economic growth in the sector. Government and industry are working together to create strong communities and support local and national economies, investing in world-class public building spaces that are functional, as well as inspiring businesses to grow. Let me just turn now to the South West. I can assure my honourable friend that the government is fully committed to a flourishing and prosperous South West. Last month, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, set out the government's long-term economic plan for the South West of England. In delivering that plan, we will increase regional productivity, create more jobs, improve infrastructure, both in terms of road and rail, and in the provision of digital communications. And my honourable friend, during his comments, did give us a couple of examples of where we were doing that, in terms of the tunnel under Stonehenge, I think he mentioned, and some of the rail improvements that will ensure a better rail service to the South West in due course. So the government is actively reforming procurement, encouraging construction and promoting regional growth, all of which is good news for companies in the South West. Nevertheless, we do recognise that there's still a lot more that we can do. Now, I am grateful to my honourable friend for the 3 comments that he raised regarding the procurement activity undertaken by the Education Funding Agency in the course of the procurement of its regional framework in the South West region. And I'd like to try to deal with each of those briefly in turn. The first one was really about tenderers selected on the basis of the one closest to the average of the tenders and not on the cheapest tenders, as I understand it. I understand from the Education Funding Agency officials that tenderers were selected on more complex price grounds than those mentioned by my honourable friend in his comments, and I'd be very happy to share with him separately details of the methodologies used. What I can assure my honourable friend is that the approach was adopted to ensure a level playing field for suppliers, preventing larger companies artificially deflating prices in their initial bid and then squeezing subcontractors in the supply chain. Contracts awarded under the framework follow a mini competition to ensure the best value for money is achieved. And my honourable friend asked about the process of procurement. So let me just see if I can briefly outline that for him. Public procurement rules apply to public purchases above defined thresholds. They require such opportunities to be advertised across Europe. In October 2013, the EFA advertised a prior information notice in the official journal of the EU. Following this, bidder days were held to explain the tender process to interested applicants. Interested firms were required to provide submissions by completing a pre-qualification questionnaire which was consistent with the government PAS 91 format. Following submission of PQQs, they were evaluated according to the published selection criteria. Shortlisted bidders were invited to tender. So I hope that gives him a feeling of confidence that the proper process was followed in this case. Of course.
The honourable member again, when his last comments was probably about as clear as mud. But
I'll try and clear it up.
But I understand it's the paper that the Minister was given. But in relation to, I don't doubt for 1 minute the sincere objectives of the government in this procurement process. But what is happening on the ground is totally different from what the Minister has just said in relation to procedures put in where subcontractors cannot be squeezed. They are being squeezed. And that's where we need to get down to the ground, to the coal face where it's happening.
Well, I thank him for raising that issue, and if that is the case, we will certainly have a look at that. I'll move on to the second issue that my honourable friend raised, that there are no companies on the framework despite there being substantial companies in the South East. Of course, yeah.
Before we move on, guys, Peter, just on this issue of whether part of the selection process related to companies, the tenders being judged as being as close as possible to the average price rather than the lowest price, having got over a quality threshold. He hasn't really, he said that I may have misunderstood the methodology and it's very complex, he's prepared to share it with me, but for the purposes of this debate, am I wrong on that, or is that part of the process that's taking place?
Well, if he will allow me, I will come to that. And just going back to the previous intervention, where there is poor practice in the system, that we do have a mystery shopper system that will investigate that thoroughly. So if there are companies that are being squeezed and there is poor practice, it is called a mystery shopper system, which is, again, probably mystifying everybody else. But it is a system, and it is a system that, by and large, has yielded significant results for those people who have made complaints to it. As a contracting authority for the purposes of the applicable legislation, the Public Contracts Regulation 2006, which was set up by the previous Labour government, the Education Funding Agency is bound by its requirements of objectivity and non-discrimination. These extend to a duty not to extend preferential treatment purely on the grounds of a bidder's geographical location at the time of submitting a tender. Education Funding Agency's officials have assured me that robust and effective selection criteria were applied in this exercise. Officials have also assured me that, in line with legal requirements, evaluation criteria to be applied were shared openly with all bidders in this exercise. It's also important to remember that the largest part of procurement spend in the construction industry is with subcontractors, the majority of whom will be local suppliers. And I know that my honourable friend has tried to sort of block that particular avenue to explore off for me, but the evidence is that subcontractors are local in most cases. Now, if he is telling me that in the southwest local subcontractors are not being used, I will ask my officials to take a look at what is happening in the southwest in particular. But in other areas, that doesn't seem to be the case. And in the case of the French company, who are one of the 7 companies who are on the list of the EFA, they bought out a UK company that was active in the southwest, an organisation called, I think it was called Ledbetter. I'm not sure of the full details of that purchase, but I know that they were already active in the southwest at the time. You've never heard of them? Okay. Of course.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way on the point of subcontractors in particular. If he has figures around that, it would be very, very helpful, I think, to all of us to see them perhaps at a later date if he doesn't have them to hand. But I'd also be really grateful if he'd addressed the point that I made about the power imbalance between subcontractors and contractors, and whether the Cabinet Office has any plans to make sure that even where local or regional companies aren't granted the primary contract, that subcontractors still have the ability to take part in those processes without detriment.
Well, of course, I have described a situation where if there is an imbalance and subcontractors are being, for want of a better word, abused in the service that they're providing to the main contractor, we do have a system, which is the mystery shopper system, that will investigate thoroughly any of those abuses. And as I've said previously, when they have investigated on behalf of individual organisations, and they have found there are problems, the actions have been taken that the organisations concerned have found very useful. So most of these concerns can be sorted out on the ground while these contracts are being supplied. So, and the third point my honourable friend made was, out of the 7 firms, I'm afraid, there are 3 foreign firms, including the French one, which I've just referred to. Public sector procurers are required to seek value for money through fair and open competition. Through our membership of the European Union and as a signatory to international agreements, our contracting authorities are required to treat suppliers from Europe and various other countries on an equal footing with UK suppliers. This is a two-way street as it gives our suppliers access to public procurement markets overseas, maximising value for money for the UK taxpayer whilst ensuring that UK companies are able to compete abroad. The government wants UK companies to be successful in public procurement. The best way to bring this about is for those companies to offer the goods and services we need at quality levels and whole life costs representing value for money. To this end, the government is seeking to ensure its large-scale purchasing power supports the task of boosting growth and enables us to actively shape the UK market for the long term. To place a value on a bid based on the geographical origin of the bidder would be contrary to the single market. All the same, this government understands the importance of having a long-term approach to how it supports UK business and aligning activity to deliver it. As part of this work, several areas where government action can have a real and early impact have been identified. These are sectors, technologies, access to finance, skills and procurement. Strategies for 11 key sectors, including construction, are being developed in partnership with business. I should also point out that use of the Education Funding Agency regional framework is not mandatory. I'm aware of 2 other construction frameworks for the South West. Construction Framework South West, managed by Devon County Council, has 11 suppliers, 9 of which are British, including Midas. South West Consultancy Framework, managed by Torbay Council, has 7 suppliers, of which 6 are British. This government is committed to increasing opportunity for suppliers of all sizes to bid for work successfully through the procurement reforms described, which also secure value for money for the British taxpayer.
Before he sits down, we're grateful to the Honourable Minister, my friend, for giving way. Have his officials been able to provide him with a list of British companies who've won contracts in France where the funding comes from the French government?
Before this debate, I haven't had any such list provided, but during the debate, and I think it was from memory this was provided rather than looking at a list or anything, and I think we should go away and do some research and we can write to you with that information. But I understand there is a company based in West Cumbria that just won a £1 million contract in France, which we're not quite clear whether it was government funded or not. But I think the best way to deal with that would be to write to my honourable friend.
Order. Order. I suspend the sitting to 4 o'clock. Thank you. Order. Order. The sitting is resumed. We now come to allegations of misconduct and human rights abuse by a British oil exploration firm in Democratic Republic of Congo. I have pleasure to call Tessa Munt. Tessa.
Thank you, Dr. McRae. I'm very pleased to have secured this debate on the activities of the London-listed oil company Soko International plc's activities in the Democratic Republic of Congo's Virunga National Park. Virunga, a documentary which covers many of the matters highlighted today, was shortlisted for an Oscar this past weekend. In the limited time I have today, I hope to draw attention to the allegations of corruption and human rights abuses that have arisen following the arrival of Soko International in 2007 in Virunga, Virunga being a United Nations educational, scientific and cultural organisation's World Heritage Site. It should be noted that Soko International has been offered the chance to respond to the allegations that will be laid out this afternoon. It has strenuously denied making illicit payments or intimidating civil society opponents in Virunga. However, the company has so far failed to provide a convincing response to the very specific evidence of wrongdoing that will be described. The Virunga documentary and Global Witness's Drillers in the Mist report contain further detailed evidence of improper behaviour. Soko International is one of the UK's 200 biggest companies, listed on the FTSE 250, with oil and gas operations in Asia and Africa. It turned its attention to Virunga after the Democratic Republic of Congo government declared 85% of the park would be divided up into oil blocks. There was an outcry following that decision because Virunga is Africa's oldest and most biodiverse national park and is home to some 220 endangered mountain gorillas. UNESCO says oil exploration and drilling are completely incompatible with World Heritage Site status. The Virunga documentary and research by anti-corruption campaigners Global Witness have revealed that, in addition to threatening the World Heritage status of the park, Soko International and its contractors have made illicit payments, appear to have paid off armed rebels, and benefited from fear and violence in the Virunga area in DRC. Soko International, as mentioned, has denied the allegations. However, the evidence is compelling. In the documentary, Soko International's military liaison officer Major Ferrucci, is caught on a hidden camera offering a $3,000 bribe to a park ranger. Ferrucci wanted the ranger to spy on Virunga's chief warden, Emmanuel de Merode, who has been singled out by Soko International representatives as a key opponent to the company's ambitions in the park. The army officer refers to a Soko International contractor as his boss. Under the UK Bribery Act, it is a crime for a UK company to fail to prevent an act of bribery carried out on its behalf. The film also presents evidence of payments to a Congolese MP for the area covering Virunga, who was also, at the time, a government minister. That minister campaigned vociferously on Soko International's behalf and helped organise payments to local organisations to hold a pro-oil demonstration in the park. The MP was filmed covertly saying that Soko International officials told him that signing a contract with him was likely to be illegal under British law as he was a public official. Soko International's official focal point in the Park Authority is also on film, telling rangers that those who work with Soko International will get money, 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 and those who oppose the company will be fired. From this material, it seems that there's a clear case for the UK enforcement agencies to investigate Soko International under the Bribery Act. This information and film footage has been in the public domain for several months. I'd like to ask the Minister what assurances the government can give that these allegations will be considered by the relevant enforcement agencies. While Soko International is listed in London, investigations by Global Witness note that the company has also links to the US. Its executive directors, Ed Story and Roger Cagle, American citizens who are employed through a wholly owned subsidiary company registered in Delaware. This means that these individuals fall within the jurisdiction of the United States, and there seems to be a case to be made that Soko International, under their stewardship, has breached the terms of America's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Bearing that in mind, I would like to ask the Minister whether the relevant British authorities will contact their American counterparts regarding an investigation into Soko International's activities in Virunga and ensure that they are made aware of any evidence held that Soko International has committed any offence under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's worth noting that Soccer International is, in a sense, an ambassador for British trade and industry. In Eastern DRC, Soccer is synonymous with Britain. Inevitably, UK companies investing in the developing world will often be operating in environments with high bribery risks and in jurisdictions which may lack the infrastructure necessary for the proper oversight of corporate behaviour. For that reason alone, Soccer International should be obliged to hold its staff and representatives to the strictest and highest standards of business responsibility. If a company's code of ethics is failing, and as it seems in this case, there's little willingness on the part of the company to investigate its actions or its omissions, I would like to ask the Minister what sanctions we might expect the British Government to apply to companies which break the law and damage the reputation of UK PLC. Because private UK investment in developing economies is supported as a policy of this Government, it is surely incumbent on the UK Government and its agencies to ensure that any credible evidence of corruption or other criminal behaviour by a UK company, as we have here, is fully investigated by the relevant authorities. The failure to do so risks sending a message that British companies will not be held accountable for their actions and omissions overseas. If the UK hopes to be taken seriously when we speak about responsible business practice internationally and the capacity for investment to grow economies and reduce poverty, then it must be incumbent on this Government to act without delay and to investigate fully whether Soccer International has been paying bribes or corrupting officials in the DRC. To date, the UK has only secured one corporate conviction for foreign bribery. I suspect that cases such as this, involving Soccer International, which only came to light following an independent investigation by a film company, may represent the tip of the iceberg when it comes to corporate misdemeanours in high-risk environments. The Serious Fraud Office has suffered budget cuts and institutional uncertainty, which must lead to doubts as to whether the ambitions within the Bribery Act will ever be met with the resources and political will it deserves. I'd like to ask the Minister what assurances the Government can give that foreign bribery cases will be resourced adequately now and in the future. Beyond the allegations of bribery, Soccer International's actions in Virunga threaten the integrity of the park's UNESCO World Heritage status. Virunga was already on the list of UNESCO's World Heritage sites considered to be in danger before Soccer International arrived. This status should protect it from being intentionally despoiled. The Minister may be aware that last year Soccer International backed down from working in Virunga following pressure from environmental campaigners WWF. Indeed, in her answer to a question from my fellow Vice Chair of the APPG on anti-corruption on the 17th of December 2014, the Secretary of State for International Development stated, "I expect SOCO, as a British-listed company, to adhere to the highest standards. In June this year, SOCO and WWF announced it would complete their existing programme of work at Virunga and then not undertake or commission exploratory or other drilling within the national park unless UNESCO and the government of the DRC agreed to it. In reality, Soccer International committed not to work in the park unless the Congolese government and UNESCO eventually agreed that such activities were not incompatible with its World Heritage status. The door is therefore open for Soccer International to continue to explore and drill for oil inside Virunga National Park if the boundaries of the park are redrawn, an option that the Congolese government is understood to be considering. The director of the Oscar-nominated documentary Virunga, Orlando von Eisendahl, recently described Soccer International's statement as purely a PR exercise. The Church of England, which owns £3 million worth of shares in the company, has recently demanded that Soccer International amend its statement to, and I quote, remove any room for doubt about their intentions within existing or future boundaries of a World Heritage Site, end of quote. Given the evidence already outlined, I would like to ask the Minister whether the Government continues to adopt the Secretary of State for International Development's acceptance of Soccer International's statement, a position now shown perhaps to be misplaced. I'd like to ask the Minister whether the Foreign and Commonwealth Office stands by its 2012 statement in which it opposed all oil exploration inside Virunga. I'd like to ask the Minister whether he will hold Soccer International to those standards and how. And moreover, what can and will the UK do to defend the integrity of UNESCO World Heritage status in this particular case and in principle? Belgium, Germany and the EU Parliament have all passed resolutions critical of oil exploration in Virunga. Would the Minister follow suit? Some of the most serious questions that Soccer International has to answer relate to allegations that its representatives and allies use threats and physical violence against opponents of the company's operations in Virunga. There have been worrying reports from credible and respected local organisations since at least 2012 of Soccer International's allies orchestrating a campaign of intimidation against local anti-oil activists. Soccer International's army liaison, Major Faruzi, has been identified as the driver behind much of this terror, which includes arrest and violent intimidation. But other local allies are also implicated. Local NGOs said that Faruzi's, and I quote, military status has been utilised to silence anyone who has questions about the true impact of the oil project, end of quote. On the 15th of April last year, the park's chief warden and Soccer International opponent, Emmanuel de Merode, was driving back to his Virunga HQ after depositing a dossier on Soccer International's activities with the public prosecutor in the provincial capital. His car was sprayed with bullets by unknown gunmen. Emmanuel Merode was hit twice, but miraculously survived. Soccer International felt moved to issue a public statement denying any involvement in the shooting. An article in the Daily Telegraph published in September said that in April last year, 2 fishermen were killed by soldiers protecting Soccer International compound, just hours after arguing against Soccer International's presence in their community. The deaths were verified by Human Rights Watch, according to the article. In December, the APPG on anti-corruption heard from members of civil society in the park, and their stories of intimidation were deeply concerning. One activist, Alphonse Mohindo Valivambe, told the group that he and his colleagues faced death every day in their campaign against oil activities in Virunga. Indeed, Mr. Valivambe has been forced to flee to London for 3 months in 2012, so concerned was he for his personal safety. As per the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, I would ask the Minister whether the UK's diplomatic missions in the region will support the human rights and civil society activists who are trying to defend the park's protected status, and in their capacity, in what capacity? What have the field officers done thus far to support civil society activists? And does the Foreign and Commonwealth Office feel they have done enough? Those same guidelines say that states must take responsibility for the actions of companies domiciled within their jurisdictions. I would like to ask the Minister what the UK Government can do to ensure Soccer International is conforming to these guiding principles, and what sanctions can it impose if it finds that Soccer International, its representatives or allies, have committed human rights abuses. Thank you, sir.
A pleasure to call the Right Honourable David Lidington, Minister.
Dr McRae, can I first congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Wells, for securing this debate today. She's brought to the House a case study in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has certainly attracted widespread attention, not only in the United Kingdom, but globally, and which brings together 2 related but distinct issues: the question about the protection of the unique environment of the Virunga National Park, and the specific serious allegations that have been made, and which my honourable friend related in her speech, about the conduct, the alleged conduct of one company. And I want to try and address both those questions in the course of my remarks. We all know that the Democratic Republic of Congo is both one of the most beautiful places on earth, but also a country which, particularly in the eastern region, has been beset by conflict, where there have been grave human rights abuses, and where there remain endemic and appalling levels of human poverty. The coalition government is committed to supporting the Democratic Republic of Congo develop and grow, and our assistance to that country is lifting people out of poverty, helping to improve security and human rights, and supporting an improved business climate. There is a long way to go, I'm the first to agree. But the government, through our international development programme, is investing in reforms to increase access to finance, job creation and the promotion of opportunities for entrepreneurs, especially women and young people, and also in essential infrastructure to increase access to markets. So far as the extractive sector in the DRC is concerned, our objective is to make it more transparent and more accountable, given its potential to be an engine for growth and public revenue generation. But for that to happen, any development of extractive industries in the DRC needs to be done in a way which both meets domestic legal requirements in the DRC and which conforms to international norms, laws and codes on the extractive industries. And we certainly expect any United Kingdom company to be setting an example in that respect and not trying to subvert those standards. Yes.
I apologise for not being here from the start of the debate, and I'm sure my EPBG colleague will have made the case in a robust way. He mentioned the role of UK companies. Obviously, there are those that represent our overseas territories and crown dependencies that had some role in the Virunga situation. What action can we take against those jurisdictions if we do have some responsibility?
I may come to that later on. My honourable friend asked about our political engagement with the DRC government as well. We are committed to working with the DRC government to try to spread values of the rule of law, transparency and good governance that we believe are right in principle, but would also, the implementation of which would also help the DRC to bring about both improvement in the material standards of living and a better quality of life overall for its people. And we are committed to supporting UK companies in the DRC. Foreign investment in sectors such as hydrocarbons and extractive industries can play an important role in boosting the development of countries like the DRC and lifting people out of poverty. But the government's long-standing position has been and remains to oppose all oil exploration in the Virunga National Park. Virunga is a World Heritage Site listed by UNESCO as being in danger, and the government's position on this has not changed. Any investment in this World Heritage Site would need to be done responsibly and sustainably in compliance with local law and conforming to international standards. So the government welcomed the announcement that SOCO plc made on the 11th of June 2014 in conjunction with the Worldwide Fund for Nature. SOCO then pledged that it would complete its existing programme of work in Virunga and committed itself not to undertake or commission exploratory or other drilling within the Virunga National Park unless UNESCO and the DRC government both agreed that such activities were not incompatible with the park's World Heritage status. We also welcome SOCO's commitment not to conduct any operations in other World Heritage sites. And I want to emphasise to the House that we expect SOCO to honour those commitments. And if we have evidence that SOCO is breaking those commitments that it entered into publicly, then we will have no hesitation in pressing the government of the DRC, or, if it is another jurisdiction, the government of that country, to take the appropriate action.
Thank you, Mr. Giving way. You'll understand my confusion when I think what the gentleman said was that, therefore, the 2012 statement, which opposed all oil exploration inside the national park, in the Virunga National Park, that is a statement which he has just confirmed is still current. But there is clearly pressure, potentially, from the company on members of the government or possibly UNESCO, but more likely to be members of the government, DRC, to redraw the lines of the boundary of the Virunga National Park. And I would therefore like him to confirm that the existing boundaries are those which we recognise, and that is it.
By breach of, when I referred to potential breaches of the commitments into which SOCO had entered, I would include within that definition any attempt by SOCO to seek the redrawing of the boundaries of the Virunga National Park to suit those commercial interests. And I think that we particularly welcomed in the June 2014 statement the fact that any sort of agreement on development would need the consent not just of the DRC government, for the reasons that my honourable friend intimated in her speech, but of UNESCO too, I think was very important, so that there was a double lock on any such assessment. We believe there should be no attempt to delist Virunga as a World Heritage Site or a national park, nor should any further company be awarded exploration rights there. And we continue to urge the government of the DRC to respect the international conventions to which it itself is a signatory. We're aware of the allegations of wrongdoing that my honourable friend has repeated today against SOCO corporately, its employees and its agents connected to its activities in Virunga. Those allegations included some that were indeed listed in the documentary film Virunga. The Serious Fraud Office is aware of those allegations, and I'm sure that the House would understand, Dr. McRae, that it is important that the decision about whether or not to prosecute in any case is one that is taken by the prosecutorial authorities and not by politicians. We would expect all companies, either registered in or operating in the United Kingdom, to act appropriately and in compliance with the law, and we encourage anyone with evidence of serious fraud, bribery or corruption to contact the FSO. We have, as government, explained to some of the Virunga campaign groups how exactly they should go about supplying any evidence they might have securely to the Serious Fraud Office so the SFO could then investigate. My honourable friend asked about the UK's sort of broader approach to combating corruption, to seeing the implementation of the Bribery Act. The government published the United Kingdom's anti-corruption plan in December last year. That sets out how the government is doing more across Whitehall's areas of responsibility to increase transparency and tackle money laundering, and to ensure that the UK is at the forefront of efforts to raise international standards. The plan sets out a range of measures that we are taking to tackle corruption around the world. Priorities include identifying illicit financial flows and the return of stolen assets, and efforts to raise global standards for all, including through our international development programmes, and also to promote sustainable growth, including through work to stop bribery. We are committed to going further by leading the way on the international stage, as was done in particular at the 2013 Enniskillen G8 summit, by pressing on the international community the benefit of measures such as publicly accessible registers of company beneficial ownership in the fight against illicit financial flows. And the purpose of embodying this in an anti-corruption plan is precisely to enable there to be more effective and more transparent collaboration across government, to try to break out of a silo mentality and to ensure that the efforts of all government departments and agencies are directed effectively to securing our objectives. If the honourable gentleman will forgive me, I have given way once to him already, and I do want to reply to the points my honourable friend made. Our embassies and high commissions and consulates are active in supporting the effective implementation of the UK Bribery Act 2011, something that I think has been recognised as a world-leading piece of legislation. And our posts overseas are always keen to ensure that British companies are fully aware of their obligations under the Bribery Act when they seek to invest or trade in any of those foreign jurisdictions. We're also working to improve standards of anti-corruption legislation and enforcement amongst our international trading partners through the OECD, the UN and the Council of Europe Conventions Against Corruption. Within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, a new central anti-corruption and transparency team was established in August 2013 Its remit includes improving the support and guidance provided to officials overseas and exchanging best practice. We have supported the government of the DRC in particular to improve its business environment. In 2012, we supported the launch of the Business Code of Conduct, an initiative of the DRC Private Sector Anti-Corruption Initiative, and already around 20 companies adhere to that private sector code of conduct. On International Anti-Corruption Day, the 9th of December 2013, we supported the signing of the DRC's National Anti-Corruption Pact between the public sector, private sector and civil society, and Prime Minister Matata personally attended the event. We think that the best way forward is to persist with those efforts and also to work to improve both economic growth and the human rights situation within the DRC. I'm not going to stand here, Dr. McRae, and pretend that the DRC is going to be brought to prosperity, political stability, and high standards of anti-corruption overnight. I think it is still a long task lies ahead of us and our international partners, but I believe that the course that we have established is starting to deliver some results. Give way again to my friend.
Thank you, Minister, greatly for letting me intervene again. Can I just ask him to address those points about the fact that there are American citizens involved in this particular company and the masking of company identity into individuals who are involved in companies that are registered in Delaware, which is a perpetual problem, and whether in fact something can be done with our American counterparts about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Yes, what I will do is write to my honourable friend in more detail about that point, because I think I would like to check whether, in the case of the American prosecutorial and judicial authorities, any evidence or information that might lead to prosecution has to be transmitted on particular international legal channels rather than just being through diplomatic or political channels. But if there is a legal channel that would enable evidence that might exist to be sent to the American authorities, then I will alert her to that, certainly. If I can respond to the honourable gentleman's points about the overseas territories, the Prime Minister has made it clear to the overseas territories that he wants them to follow the United Kingdom's lead and to mandate publicly accessible registers of company beneficial ownership. The overseas territories are, of course, not fully independent, but they have their own legislatures and they each have their own democratic and constitutional arrangements. Most of the overseas territories decided to go out and consult on the question of public accessible registers. The majority of those consultations have taken place, and most territory governments are still analysing the results of those consultations. We're keeping them informed of how our register will work in practice so that they can take that into account when considering what works best for them. But the UK government has made it very clear that we expect the British Overseas Territories to apply the highest international standards when it comes to such things as registers of beneficial ownership, and this is something that the Prime Minister personally has made it very clear that he intends to pursue. I would like to highlight the UK government's commitment to the region and to the Eastern DRC in particular. Our development assistance and political engagement are targeted on what's really important: bringing people out of poverty, promoting the rule of law, transparency and good governance, supporting civil society and encouraging economic growth. But in pursuing those objectives, we will always ensure that while we support responsible British investment in the DRC by United Kingdom companies, we expect high standards, we expect those companies to follow legal obligations, and we will continue to make businesses aware of their obligations under the Bribery Act of 2011. Virunga is a jewel in the centre of Africa. The people who live there, the rich biodiversity of the region should be protected for future generations. We support the idea of the alternative vision for Virunga that emphasises such enterprises as sustainable fisheries, ecotourism and small-scale hydropower. And I'd like Dr. McRae to finish by applauding the tenacity and bravery of the director of the Virunga National Park, Emmanuel de Merode, and his rangers. Their work has had a real impact on bringing this issue to the attention of the world and ensuring that the importance of Virunga and the need to protect it is not forgotten.
We now move on to the final issue for today, effects on mining in Goa by UK listed companies. I have pleasure to call John McDonnell.
Thank you, Dr. McRae. This is about the effects of mining in Goa by UK-listed companies, and I raise it because I have a sizable number of constituents of Goan origin in Hayes and Harlington, not least one of them being my wife. Goans take an absolute pride in the beauty of their state in India, from the beauty of its architecture, the buildings, the homes, the towns, the churches, the temples, to the long, unspoilt beaches along its coast and the absolutely breathtaking splendour of the mountains of the Western Ghats. And it's that deep beauty, that deep feeling for the environmental beauty of their home country that's mobilised Goans both at home and abroad to expose and take head-on the devastating threat from mining that has disfigured its hills, polluted its rivers, undermined its agriculture and put at risk its tourist trade over recent decades. My reason for bringing this issue to the attention of the House is first because it's a London-listed mining company, Vedanta, and its subsidiary, Sessa Sterlite, that have been at the forefront of the mining practices which have caused such environmental, social and economic devastation, but also because these next few months constitute an absolutely critical time for determining whether the future of the mining industry in Goa will be, well, we'll see either return to the rapacious profiteering exploitation of the Goan environment, or whether Goa will strike out on a new path in which there's not only a respect for the environment, but also the establishment of institutional arrangements which ensure the past and future earnings from mining are invested in the interests of the Goan people. And I think by offering both moral and practical support, we in the UK could assist those Goan campaigners who are working so hard and courageously to ensure a sustainable future for Goa's economy and in the environment. And I also think there's much that we can learn from their campaigning in the recent past to protect their environment. Goa combines a richness in mineral resources with a rich and diverse environment. The Goan Foundation was established in 1986 by members of the Goan community to protect and promote a sustainable environment for the state. And since the early 1990s, the foundation has worked to achieve a balance between mining and protecting the environment. The foundation describes in a recent report how in the decades prior to 2012, the environment of Goa became the victim of, to quote, unbridled mining by greedy mining companies an administration that steadfastly looked the other way. In one of its most recent reports, the Goa Foundation explains what happened during the period in the decade before 2012, and I quote, it says, as prices skyrocketed due to robust demand from China, miners flouted rules to extract as much iron ore as possible, while government officials looked on and even joined in the plunder. As a result of reckless mining, our natural environment suffered irreparable damage due to the mining operations, adversely affected the surrounding ecology and assaulting public health. Since most mining leases are located in forest areas, we lost many hectares of prime forest which can never be replaced. Our streams dried up and our rivers ran red with the mud from the mining dumps. We denuded entire hills and replaced these with new mountains made up of nothing but mining waste. Campaigners also published a short report in July 2011 about what happened at the village of Mulgao that year as a result of unrestrained mining operations. One of the largest mining sites is visible as you fly into Goa. It's an open cast iron ore operation, 14 kilometres in length, carved through tropical forests, cutting across fertile farmland and polluting vital water sources. In July in 2011, a large section of the mine's outer wall collapsed during heavy rain. Thousands of tons of silt and mud cascaded into adjacent settlements, swamping paddy fields, polluting lakes, destroying trees, and risking lives. The company whose woeful negligence led to this disaster is Sessa Goa, owned and managed by the London-registered Vedanta. This is not the first time the company has been held responsible for this sort of calamity. A similar collapse occurred in June 2009 at 2 other Vedanta pits in the same area. The company was ordered to close them down and neglected to do so. For 2 years running, Vedanta flagrantly ignored the Goa's air and water pollution control regulations. Thanks to determined and courageous campaigning by the Goa Foundation, in 2012 the Indian government established under Justice Shah a commission to investigate the mining industry in Goa. The Shah Commission exposed systematic illegality, mining taking place without necessary licenses in place and in areas outside the leased areas themselves. And I just quote from the Justice Shah Commission. It said, "The regulatory mechanism has totally collapsed and irregularities due to maladministration have risen to its peak. In the process, the sole loser is the environment, the ecosystem of the Western Ghats, the general public and the treasury of Goa State." The report of the Public Accounts Committee also reported, and I quote, "This is a complete breakdown of all machineries provided by the statute which are required to ensure that mining is undertaken and carried out in a legally permissible manner. The term irregular mining is nothing but illegal mining." The 3 reports of the Shah Commission and the Supreme Court Centrally Empowered Committee exposed the illegal and corrupt practices of the mining companies and their political allies, including the use of force and forgeries. I visited one of the lawyers representing local village communities in their attempts to protect their local environment and their local farming from the mining industry. He explained the standard practices of intimidation that the mine owners had used against anyone that stood up to them. He explained that first they try to bribe you to stay quiet. If that fails, they send in what are called the gundas, the thugs, to threaten you. And when that fails, they lodge spurious claims against you at the local police, including, in his case, a claim of attempted murder. I want to pay tribute to the courage and the determination of the lawyers and the campaigners and the honest politicians who've stood up to this intimidation. The Commission also estimated that the mining continuing on such a scale in Goa would ensure the complete removal of all mineral wealth within 9 years. The result of the Shah Commission's report was that mining operations in Goa were suspended in September 2012 and the Supreme Court ordered a ban on mining operations in the state in October 2012. Subsequently, the Supreme Court judged in a case brought by the Goa Foundation that the mining operations, including extraction, sale and export of ore from all Goa mining leases, was illegal from November 2007, when the validity of the leases came to an end and the leases were not renewed. It held that all mining dumps and dumping outside mines was illegal. It held the operation of leases by persons and companies who are not leaseholders illegal. It asked an expert committee to revert with a cap on ore production within 12 months, an interim cap of 20 million tonnes a year. It gave the Environmental Ministry 6 months to issue a formal notification declaring a buffer zone of 1 kilometre around various sanctuaries and areas protected within Goa itself. In the light of this judgment, the Goa Foundation has explored in expert detail, working with the Natural Resources Government Institute in Oxford and the Cambridge Judge Business School Centre for Endowment Asset Management, how Goans can halt the loss to the Goan community of the massive wealth that has been generated by mining. The Foundation proposed that from here on, funds raised from mining, including the mining of the dumps, should be placed in a permanent fund managed independently of the government and invested independently. The income from the fund would be utilised for the welfare of Goa citizens, with clearly defined entitlements related to educational opportunities, health facilities, housing and rehabilitating the environment damaged by the mining operations. The model for the permanent fund it looked to was the Norwegian pension fund, which was created from the sale of oil resources and has amassed $870 billion for a 5 million population. I commend the Foundation for its creativity and foresight. I hope our own government looks in the same way at some of the developments with regard to our own shale gas industry. The Supreme Court decided that a Goan iron ore permanent fund should be established with 10% of all mineral oil sales proceeds to be allocated to the fund. The Goan state government has notified a permanent fund scheme, but the scheme notified on makes the scheme impermanent. And this will almost certainly be open to challenge by the Goa Foundation. In addition, the capture rate, i.e. the amount of the intrinsic value of the assets from mining allocated to funds set at 10%, is viewed as, by many as unrealistically low. Under India's own Goan Mines and Minerals Act 1957, the Goan government has a duty to recover all revenues and profits from mining operations conducted without a valid lease. The Goan Foundation has assessed the minimum amount recoverable from the illegal iron ore mining from November 2007 until September 2012, and it looked in particular at Vedanta's subsidiary, Sesa Steelite, and its own exports during this period. Sesa Goa is by far the largest producer and exporter of iron ore from Goa, controlling about 30% of the volume. And when it looked at those 4 years, it estimated that at an estimated price of $60 per tonne, the amount payable to the people of Goa for the illegal export of ore by this company would be 3.687 billion. Another estimate has put it even higher. So a contribution to a permanent fund of this magnitude would fund significant social and investment in the health, education, employment and quality of life of all Goans for the long-term future. However, under pressure from the mining companies, the Goa government has decided to renew almost all the mining leases instead of recovering the significant amounts owing to the Goan community or even auctioning off the leases. In other states, including neighbouring Karnataka, it is proposed that to auction the mine leases on a revenue share basis with a minimum bid of 35%, considerably higher than the 10% contribution to the permanent fund proposed for Goa. I attended Vedanta's most recent annual general meeting, and I expected to see an impairment written into its accounts to take account of its liability for paying back the 3.68 billion it had earned from the illegal iron ore deposits from 2007 to 2012. This figure was not set aside in the accounts, and in its annual report there was no reference to the illegal mining that the Supreme Court had found it to be operating from 2007 onwards. At the time of the publication of the Vedanta annual report, the High Court had not determined the renewal of the leases, and neither had the Goan state government. I have to say, suspiciously, Vedanta felt confident that it could exercise its influence sufficiently over the government to avoid paying for its illegal mining activities and would soon be up and running again in its own mines. I hope that the determined and courageous campaigning by the Goa Foundation will win out and the permanent fund be established with sufficient income from the past illegally mined assets of the Goan people and the future environmentally sustainable operations. I'm confident that the heroes and heroines of the Foundation will be successful. Their determination is to be admired, and I pay tribute to a number of them. Dr. Claude Alves, its director, Rahul Basu, Dean de Cruz, Carmen Miranda and Samendra Das, all of whom have courageously, at some risk to themselves, have stood up to be counted on behalf of the Goan people. However, I do fear for the future, whilst rogue companies like Vedanta are allowed to destroy environments, undermine communities, abuse human rights with virtual impunity. Vedanta is a UK-listed company. It enjoys the prestige and financial benefits of being listed in London. The UK, therefore, has a responsibility to monitor and police its operation, in particular its adherence to international conventions and treaties on civil liberties and environmental impacts. The company has gained a reputation for abuse of human rights, tax avoidance and environmental degradation in its operations in Zambia and India. In 2007, Norway's Council on Ethics concluded, and I quote, "Continuing to invest in Vedanta would present an unacceptable risk of contributing to grossly unethical activities." And in response, the Norwegian Sovereign Pension Fund sold all its Vedanta shares. Only last week, the company was involved in yet another scandal when civil servants were arrested for leaking information from the mining industry to the company itself. In 2010, after 6 months' engagement, the Church of England divested its shares in Vedanta on the basis that Vedanta, and I quote, had not shown it likely or in the future to show a level of respect for human rights and local communities we expect in companies in which the Church invests. In the debate on the legislation erecting the new architecture to supervise our banking and finance system, I moved various amendments to award the new Financial Conduct Authority the powers to supervise the adherence of London-listed companies to international treaties and conventions on human rights, labour law and environmental sustainability. More recently, the Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee, in its report on the extractive industries, published this year, warned about the negative impacts on local and indigenous communities of the mining industry, and welcomed the work being done by the government to increase openness and transparency, signing up to EU directives. But it also went on to support my view, and I quote, that we believe that the government should consider expanding the FCA's remit to include not only oversight of financial transparency, but also the social, environmental and corporate governance reporting for companies applying to list on the London Stock Exchange. If it's felt not appropriate for the FCA, the Select Committee went on to recommend to the government that it should determine which body should have the remit to do so and to fulfil this role. Let me just say this. Successive governments have watched the excesses of the deregulated finance sector and banks and did nothing. And as a result, we have endured an economic crisis that's produced immense hardship here and across the globe. If we also sit back and do nothing to control and curtail the damaging, divisive and destructive activities of rogue companies like Vedanta, a UK-listed company, the long-term consequences for our country, its reputation, its standing in the world, and for our environment could be equally devastating. I urge action for the government, supporting the Goan community, of course, but also, as importantly, controlling the excesses of the likes of Vedanta as they seek to trample over the lives of people and communities across the globe. Already, there are concerns now for the environmental impact if the mines start operating again in an uncontrolled fashion that will undermine the Goan environment, the Goan economy, and the quality of lives of the Goan community. I urge now the government to do all it can to support those campaigners who bravely campaigned to protect the environment of Goa and to secure the rewards of the mineral resources of Goa itself for the people themselves.
Minister to respond.
Thank you very much, Dr McRae. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington for securing this debate and taking us through a fascinating but deeply worrying and concerning history of mining in Goa, and he clearly has a great constituency interest in this matter, as well as indeed a personal interest. I think the details that he outlined of the damage that can be created to the natural environment in terms of deforestation, in terms of pollution, in terms of public health, and of course the impact of corruption on the population is significant and is sadly not the only location where that has been seen. The natural resources can be a huge benefit to countries. They can be used in a positive way to improve and develop the economy of countries which are blessed to have them if they are managed well. And indeed, they can transform poor countries. Just to take Nigerian oil exports in 2012, they were almost $100 billion. That's more than the total net aid to the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. In 2007, we saw Botswana become an upper-middle-income country, but back in 1966, it was one of the world's poorest countries when they gained independence. And of course, their success since then has largely been due to well-managed mining revenues from diamonds. So mining developments internationally have the potential to dramatically boost economic growth and to provide a real route out of poverty for resource-rich countries. However, there are also many examples where the temptation of such money
leads to corruption, leads to the kind of problems that the Honourable Member outlined in his speech, and where natural resources can be more of a curse than a blessing to particular countries. The extractive companies, whether they're listed or unlisted, are important partners that we work with in government, and we want to make sure that developing countries can make the most of their natural resources to tackle poverty. We are, of course, very committed to increasing transparency in this sector, encouraging strong, transparent and accountable institutions to properly regulate extractives and promote open markets and societies. This means we need to facilitate an environment where resource-rich developing countries and regions can attract responsible investment to help them transform the vast potential that natural resources offer into growth, jobs and indeed development. In 2013, under the UK presidency of the G8, we secured a commitment to working towards common global standards of extractives transparency. We want to level the playing field for business internationally and provide information for more citizens all around the world to hold their governments to account for how these resources are used. We also, in the G8, launched 8 partnerships working with companies, governments and civil society in resource-rich countries to improve transparency, build accountability and the capacity to manage the resources better. And of course, the work through DFID, country offices, is helping resource-rich developing countries to derive the maximum benefits from oil, gas and mining projects. The problems that have been described by the Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington, of course, significantly impact on the human rights of the population in Goa, the right to health, to clean water, to due legal process. And as he will be aware, the UK-listed companies are already required to report on the human rights implications of their operations. These reports that are currently required will be, of course, further strengthened under the recently agreed directive on non-financial reporting, which will be in place by 2017, which requires listed companies to include information on human rights in their strategic report. High standards of reporting on human rights issues are an inherent part of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were adopted in 2011. In 2013, the UK was the first country to publish an action plan on business and human rights, which sets out the government's expectations of business to respect human rights at all times. And I was delighted in December to attend the 3rd UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in Geneva, which had a constructive atmosphere with an increased business presence and civil society very engaged in making it a success. This is an agenda where we now have the UN action in place, increasing number of countries producing action plans, though not yet enough, and we want to encourage work and progress on this in countries around the world, and I think the UK is indeed showing leadership on this issue. Indeed, this evening I'll be launching the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework, which provides for the first time a comprehensive standard for reporting so that companies can be held to account by shareholders and customers. This reporting framework applies to all sectors, which of course includes extractives. Newmont Mining is one of 5 companies, for example, that have committed to apply the framework straight away. So the combination of enhanced disclosure in the strategic report with the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework setting the standard for that disclosure will mean that from 2017 listed companies will be much more effectively held to account for the human rights impacts of their operations. And it's for that reason I am proud of the work this government has done on human rights, and we are leading the way on extractive transparency too. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI, we committed back in May 2013 that the UK would sign up to it. And in October, after a lot of work by a multi-stakeholder group, we gained candidacy status formally and will proceed to produce the first reports. And I think the way in which UK corporations have engaged with civil society and government, that approach has been very constructive and a real example of how progress can be made. And it is the whole process of EITI is to build that trust and dialogue and then to put information into the public domain, which then of course prompts public debate. And this can be a very, very useful tool for holding companies to account. To just give an example, Democratic Republic of Congo, which is not renowned for its good governance necessarily. EITI was the first time that different stakeholders sat around the same table to discuss mining sector management. And of course, that kind of dialogue and cooperation can actually help to prevent conflict as well. Now, of course, many extractive companies listed or headquartered in the UK are active in supporting EITI. For example, Rio Tinto and Shell are part of that multi-stakeholder board that I mentioned. And the UK's intention in signing up to EITI is to show that it's not just for developing countries. We want to show that it's not just about the UK telling other countries what they need to do, but that we recognise we need to lead the way also, and that gives us a much stronger argument in our international discussions on this issue. In addition to EITI, there is, of course, also Chapter 10 of the Accounting Directive, which requires listed and large extractive companies to report the payments they make to all governments. And the government committed to implementing this early. Our regulations came into force in December of 2014. The Financial Conduct Authority, which the Honourable Gentleman mentioned, has also changed its rules to require listed companies who are not registered here in the UK to report. And this implements the requirements of the Transparency Directive. Companies will be required to report their payments to governments from the 1st of January of this year, which is 6 months ahead of the EU's transposition deadline. And so we'll start to see the reports being published during 2016. Of course, bribery and corruption are barriers to trade and growth, and the UK is a signatory to the UN Convention Against Corruption and the OECD Bribery Convention. The government published the first UK anti-corruption plan on the 18th of December last year, bringing together all of the UK's anti-corruption efforts under one cross-departmental plan. The Bribery Act came into force in July 2011, so a company that's carrying on business in the United Kingdom can be prosecuted for bribery anywhere in the world. And on the other hand, those companies that can also trade on the honesty and integrity that the Bribery Act therefore implies. So this is something which has a benefit for business too. I'm aware of the particular issues that the Honourable Gentleman raised about Vedanta in particular, and it is important that companies that are listed in London as a key financial centre and are therefore UK companies are held to high standards. And of course, quoted companies, these strategic reports have to include information about environmental risk. Of course, some of the corporate governance failures will not necessarily be addressed purely through shareholders holding companies to account. That is one way in which there is accountability, and it is an important route. But some failures might be so serious that the company and directors might be exposed to criminal liability. For example, if a commercial organisation failed to put in place adequate procedures to prevent bribery, then of course they could be criminally liable under the Companies Act. And I think it's important to be incredibly clear on this. We expect all UK businesses to comply with all applicable laws and respect internationally recognised human rights wherever they operate. It is no excuse for offences to be in another jurisdiction, and therefore for a company to feel that they can get away with behaviour and practices in another distant part of the world that they would certainly not be even attempting to get away with here. And the trust and transparency element of this is incredibly important. That's why we have prioritised these issues as part of our corporate governance framework, and we have wide-ranging reforms in the Small Business, Enterprise and Employment Bill to enhance corporate transparency and increase trust in UK business. One of the things which is central to this is implementing a publicly accessible central register of information on the people who ultimately own and control companies, the persons of significant control. And we are proud to be leading globally in this space and encouraged by the growing international momentum on these issues too. For example, the soon-to-be adopted fourth Money Laundering Directive will require all EU member states to hold company beneficial ownership information in a central register. So, in conclusion, Dr McRae, I think that the Honourable Gentleman has raised very serious issues. It is absolutely right that he has done so, and I think that very often in this place it is positive that particular problems, sometimes in one particular area of the world, one particular company and their practices can be highlighted in this place, and a real spotlight shone on those activities, as he has indeed done today in calling this debate on mining in Goa. I hope in my remarks I've been able to set out the government takes these issues incredibly seriously, and we are aiming to be a world leader in transparency, in accountability, in extractive mining companies, but indeed much more widely as well, and in encouraging businesses to take their human rights responsibilities seriously. But there is no complacency and no room for complacency, because we need to continue to promote these issues. There will always be money to be made somewhere in the world by exploiting human rights. That is unacceptable, and it is not something which in the UK we should have any truck with whatsoever. And that's why it's so important to empower citizens in Goa and elsewhere in the world to encourage the development of strong corporate governance and make sure that UK-listed mining companies are able to lead the way in these areas.
Order. The sitting stands adjourned. Thank you.